Picture this, the bustling heart of a medieval town square where the air hums with the chatter of merchants and the clatter of wooden carts. On one side, a noblewoman sweeps by in a gown with sleeves so long they drag the ground, her towering headdress casting a shadow like a miniature castle. Just steps away, a peasant bends over his work, his tunic patched and frayed, woven from coarse wool that scratches with every movement. This wasn't just fashion, it was a silent battlefield where every stitch, every fabric, even the colors you wore shouted your place in the world. Clothing in the Middle Ages was more than mere decoration. It was a coded language of power, privilege, and sometimes sheer survival. What if I told you that the width of your sleeves could determine your social rank, or that the dye in your cloak might reveal whether you were born to rule or destined to toil? From the absurdly extravagant to the ingeniously practical, medieval fashion was a world of extremes. Nobles draped themselves in silks imported from distant lands, their garments studded with gems to catch the light, because why whisper your wealth when you could scream it? Meanwhile, peasants crafted resilience into every thread, turning necessity into ingenuity with dyes made from onion skins and stitches designed to withstand a lifetime of labor. These weren't just trends, they were statements etched in fabric, woven into the very fabric of daily life. So why does this matter to us today? Because fashion has always been a mirror, reflecting who we are, who we aspire to be, and the walls society builds between us. Over the next 25 glimpses into this vivid past, we'll unravel the secrets behind those towering headdresses, decode the symbolism of a peasant's humble belt, and discover how something as simple as a button could spark a revolution. This isn't just a tour of medieval closets, it's a journey into the hearts and minds of people who used clothing as armor, as art, and sometimes as rebellion. Ready to step through the wardrobe and into a world where every thread tells a tale? Let's begin. Imagine balancing a 3-foot-tall cone on your head just to run errands. Welcome to the world of the Henin, where fashion wasn't just worn, it was endured. These towering headdresses, shaped like slender church spires and draped with floating veils, weren't just accessories, they were architectural marvels perched atop noblewomen's heads. Crafted from delicate silks or stiffened linen, each Henin was a blank canvas for extravagance, embroidered with gold thread, pinned with pearls, or even studded with tiny mirrors to catch the light. But here's the twist. The taller the Henin, the higher the status. Some were so lofty that castle doorways had to be rebuilt to accommodate them, a literal reshaping of the world to fit the whims of the elite. Why go to such absurd lengths? Because every inch of that cone screamed, "I don't lift a finger." While peasants tied their hair under simple cloths to keep it clean during labor, noblewomen turned impracticality into a badge of honor. A Henin made it impossible to bend over, rush, or even turn your head quickly, perfect for a life where servants handled everything. The veils, often so long they trailed behind like ghostly trains, required attendants to adjust them constantly. This wasn't just vanity, it was theater. Each wobbling step declared, "My time is too precious for practicality." But the Henin wasn't just about flaunting wealth, it was a masterclass in social engineering. By the 15th century, sumptuary laws banned lower classes from wearing certain fabrics or heights of headwear, making the Henin a legally enforced crown. If a merchant's wife dared to mimic the style, she risked fines or public shaming. The message was clear: fashion wasn't just about beauty, it was a barbed wire fence between classes. Yet even in rebellion, the Henin sparked irony. Some historians argue its pointed shape mirrored the rising spires of Gothic cathedrals, as if nobility were aligning themselves with divine authority, though surely even medieval clergy didn't need doorways widened for their hats. So next time you complain about uncomfortable shoes, remember the Henin, a trend so audacious it turned heads literally and reshaped architecture, all to prove one simple, ruthless truth. In the Middle Ages, your hat wasn't just an accessory. It was your social resume stitched in silk and propped up by privilege. If you thought modern fashion trends were extreme, wait until you hear about the medieval obsession with shoes that turned feet into literal works of art, the Krakow. Picture a nobleman strutting through a castle hallway, his shoes stretching nearly 2 feet in front of him, the exaggerated points so long they had to be tied to his knees with delicate chains just to keep him from tripping over his own footwear. This wasn't just style, it was a walking billboard of wealth and privilege. Krakows, named after the Polish city of Krakow where they gained popularity, were the ultimate flex in medieval footwear. The longer the toe, the higher the status, with some noblemen sporting points that reached a staggering 24 inches. These shoes weren't just impractical, they were designed to be. Crafted from the finest leathers, lined with silk, and sometimes even studded with jewels, they made it impossible to walk quickly, work, or do anything remotely useful. And that was the point. While peasants wrapped their feet in rough leather or went barefoot, nobility turned shoes into a deliberate obstacle, a way to say, "I don't need to move fast, I have people for that." But Krakows weren't without controversy. The clergy railed against them, calling them sinful and decadent, a symbol of vanity that defied modesty. Some preachers even claimed the devil himself lurked in those exaggerated points. Towns passed sumptuary laws trying, and often failing, to limit their length. Yet, like many fashion trends fueled by status, the backlash only made them more desirable. The wealthy kept stretching their toes further, turning footwear into a rebellious act of defiance against moral scolds. What's fascinating is how these shoes reveal the psychology of medieval luxury. Unlike today's discreet status symbols, a designer logo stitched inside a collar Krakows were loud. They clattered, they tripped people up, they demanded attention. In a world where social hierarchies were rigid, clothing wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about enforcing those hierarchies. A peasant couldn't wear Krakows even if they wanted to. They'd never manage fieldwork in them. And that was the unspoken rule. Fashion wasn't just what you wore, but what you could afford to endure. So the next time you slip on a pair of snug, sensible shoes, take a moment to appreciate the quiet rebellion of comfort. Because in the Middle Ages, even your toes were a political statement, one that could literally trip you up if you weren't careful. While nobles flaunted robes dipped in saffron and Tyrian purple, peasants wore their status in a far humbler hue, woad blue. This unassuming plant, crushed and fermented into a pungent vat of dye, colored the tunics of countless laborers across medieval Europe. But don't mistake its simplicity for insignificance. Woad was the backbone of peasant fashion, a pigment born from the earth and steeped in irony. The very thing that made it accessible, its cheap, local abundance, also made it infamous. Processing woad reeked like rotting cabbage mixed with ammonia, a stench so potent that dyers often worked on the outskirts of towns, far from delicate noble noses. Yet this malodorous process yielded a color so enduring it clung to fabric through countless washings, just as hard labor clung to the lives of those who wore it. What's striking is how this humble blue became a silent rebellion. While sumptuary laws dictated who could wear scarlet or ermine, no one legislated against woad. Peasants couldn't afford imported dyes, but they turned necessity into a badge of resilience. Their tunics, stitched from coarse wool and reinforced with patches at the elbows and knees, weren't just clothing, they were maps of a life spent toiling. Every man told a story, a year of harvests, a winter survived, a child's growth spurt accommodated with scraps. Unlike noble garments, discarded when fashions shifted, peasant tunics were built to last, evolving like living records of their wearers' struggles. Yet woad blue carried layers of meaning beyond practicality. In religious art, the Virgin Mary often wore robes of celestial blue, a shade peasants could never replicate with their modest dye. Instead, their faded, uneven tones became a visual shorthand for earthly humility. Over time, the color grew so associated with labor that phrases like "true blue" emerged, praising the steadfastness of common folk. Even the elite couldn't ignore its symbolic power. By the late Middle Ages, merchants and minor gentry began adopting touches of woad blue in their own garments, blurring the lines between classes in small but significant ways. So the next time you see a medieval painting, look closely at those muted blue figures in the background. Their tunics weren't just fabric, they were testaments to ingenuity, endurance, and the quiet dignity of a class that built kingdoms with their hands. Woad may have been the dye of the poor, but its legacy anything but cheap. Now imagine a garment so vast it could double as a portable tent, the houppeland, where medieval nobility turned fabric into a form of social dominance. These billowing gowns, with sleeves wide enough to swallow an armhole and hems that pooled like liquid velvet at the wearer's feet, weren't just clothing, they were walking declarations of excess. A single houppeland could use up to 20 yards of fabric, enough to outfit an entire peasant family for years, and that was precisely the point. In an era where cloth was painstakingly woven by hand, wasting material became the ultimate flex. The houppeland's design was a masterclass in impractical elegance. Sleeves flared like inverted trumpets, some so voluminous they had to be slit at the elbows just to allow the wearer to eat without draping their finery into the soup. Fur linings, ermine for kings, fox for lesser nobles, whispered with every step, a sensory reminder of status. Embroidery crawled up the fabric in elaborate vines of gold thread, each stitch a tiny monument to the hours of labor someone else had spent. Unlike the snug tunics of peasants, which clung to the body to avoid catching on plows or looms, the houppeland demanded space. It required sweeping gestures, slow strides, and an entourage to lift its train over mud, because haste was for laborers, and nobility moved through the world like ships in full sail. But the houppeland wasn't just about flaunting wealth. It was a tactical tool in the theater of power. At court, where every interaction was a chess move, the gown's exaggerated silhouette forced others to keep their distance, creating a literal buffer between the elite and the crowd. Some historians speculate the wide sleeves even served as pockets perfect for discreetly passing bribes or love notes. And let's not forget the psychological impact. Swathed in enough fabric to curtain a window, the wearer seemed larger than life, their body obscured into an imposing, shape-shifting mass. Yet for all its grandeur, the houppeland had a sly subtext. By the 15th century, wealthy merchants began commissioning their own versions, skirting sumptuary laws with subtle tweaks. Less fur, cheaper dyes mimicking nobility until the lines blurred. The elite retaliated by making their houppelands even more outrageous, adding trailing sleeves that required pages to carry them like bridal trains. It became an arms race of fabric, one that eventually collapsed under its own weight, literally. By the Renaissance, the trend faded, as even nobles grew tired of tripping over their own opulence. So the next time you slip into a cozy sweater, spare a thought for the houppeland. A garment that proved fashion isn't just about what you wear, but how much space you can afford to take up. In the Middle Ages, clothing wasn't just fabric, it was real estate. While noblewomen teetered under the weight of their Henins, peasant women had a far simpler solution to bad hair days: the coif. This unassuming linen cap tied snugly under the chin was the unsung hero of medieval practicality. Worn by women across fields, workshops, and homes, it wasn't just headgear, it was a daily armor against dust, sweat, and the relentless sun. Unlike the extravagant fabrics of nobility, coifs were spun from rough flax, bleached by sunlight, and lye soap until they softened with time. Each stitch was purposeful, double-layered at the brim to withstand wear, loosely gathered at the crown to trap stray hairs. Wash after wash, these caps grew thinner, yet they were patched and cherished like heirlooms because for many peasants, a coif wasn't just an accessory. It was often their only head covering. What's fascinating is how these humble caps became canvases for quiet creativity. Some coifs featured subtle embroidery at the edges, a single row of cross-stitch, perhaps a lover's initials hidden where only the wearer would know. Others were ingeniously designed with wide flaps to shield the neck from sunburn, long before wide-brimmed hats existed. In winter, women layered them under woolen hoods. In summer, they soaked the linen in cool water for relief from heat. This wasn't just fashion adapting to necessity, it was necessity refined into art. Yet the coif's symbolism ran deeper than thread. In a world where the church preached modesty for women, peasant headwear obeyed the rules without the extravagance. While noblewomen's veils flaunted wealth with sheer silks, a coif's opaque linen ensured humility but on the wearer's terms. Some historians note that coifs even became identifiers. A miller's wife might starch her stiff to repel flour dust, while a dairymaid's cap would be bleached spotless to signify cleanliness. In a society obsessed with status, the coif was a rare equalizer. Whether you were a brewer's daughter or a goose girl, your headgear looked much the same. The true rebellion of the coif, though, lay in its defiance of time. While noble fashions cycled through absurd trends, from horned headdresses to butterfly veils, the coif endured virtually unchanged for centuries. It wasn't dictated by royal decrees or sumptuary laws. It answered only to the rhythms of labor and seasons, and that's why it outlasted them all. Long after Henins toppled from favor and houppelandes vanished into history, you could still spot a coif bobbing through a barley field or pinned to a washing line, its edges frayed but its purpose unbroken. A testament to the quiet power of practicality, proof that sometimes the humblest garments leave the deepest imprint. If Krakows were a whisper of excess, Poulanes were a full-throated scream, shoes so audacious they sparked moral panic across medieval Europe. These elongated footwear nightmares took the pointed-toed trend to dizzying new heights, with some stretching 12 inches beyond the foot, curling upwards like scorpion tails. But here's where things get deliciously absurd. Nobles didn't just wear poulanes, they engineered them to keep those grotesque points rigid, whereas stuffed them with moss, wool, or even whalebone, turning shoes into architectural projects. Some went further, attaching chains from the toe to the knee like makeshift suspension bridges, lest their footwear flop like a dying fish with every step. What made poulanes truly scandalous wasn't just their impracticality, it was their undeniable sensuality. Critics, particularly clergy, raged that the exaggerated points resembled phallic symbols or devil's horns, calling them windows to hell that tempted wearers into vanity. In London and Paris, city officials banned poulanes outright, threatening fines for anyone daring to parade in the devil's slippers. Yet bans backfired spectacularly. Like Prohibition-era speakeasies, underground cobblers kept crafting them, and nobles flaunted their forbidden shoes with even more theatrical flair. The louder the outrage, the longer the toes grew, a medieval game of chicken between morality and fashion. Peasants, meanwhile, rolled their eyes at the spectacle. Their shoes were pragmatic, ankle-high boots waxed against rain, or leather clogs with soles thick enough to deflect field rocks. Every stitch in a peasant's shoe served a purpose: reinforced heels for plow pedals, wool linings for frostbite, while poulanes served only ego. That contrast reveals fashion's darkest irony. The more useless a garment, the more it screamed privilege. A farmer couldn't sprint after stray livestock in foot-long points, but a baron. He had stable hands for that. By the 15th century, poulanes collapsed under their own weight, both literally and culturally. Wars and famines made extravagance taboo, and the shoes shrunk back into moderation. But their legacy lingers in every red carpet stunt or runway monstrosity today. Because whether it's 6-inch heels or toe-crushing stilettos, fashion has always been about one question: how much discomfort are you willing to endure to prove you're above the rules? Poulanes answered loud and clear: all of it. Patchwork cloaks were the quilts of medieval Europe, stitched together not for beauty but for bare-knuckled survival. While nobles paraded in cloaks cut from whole bolts of Flemish wool, peasants assembled theirs from fragments: a sleeve salvaged from a discarded knight's surcoat, the hem of a grandmother's wedding kirtle, even scraps bartered from a tailor's waste pile. Each cloak was a mosaic of necessity, its irregular patches tracing years of hardship and ingenuity. Unlike the uniform crimson or emerald of noble cloaks, dyed with costly imported pigments, peasant patchworks blazed with accidental rainbows. A left-behind swatch of noble indigo might border faded woad blue, while undyed sheep's wool mellowed to a buttery cream over seasons of sun and snow. What's extraordinary is how these cloaks doubled as family archives. A mother might stitch her child's first tunic into the lining as an extra layer against winter winds. A patch of saffron-dyed linen, pilfered from a noble's torn banner, could signify the year a village revolted against taxes. Even the stitching itself held secrets: herringbone seams for flexibility in the fields, double-threaded edges where firewood bundles wore the fabric thin. Historians have found cloaks with up to 15 distinct fabrics in a single garment, layered like the rings of a tree, each marking a season of scarcity or respite. Nobles, of course, missed the poetry in patchwork. Their cloaks were monuments to instant abundance: squirrel fur linings so lush they shed like living creatures, wool so finely woven it draped like liquid. A duke's cloak might fasten with a single silver clasp, its weight alone worth a peasant's annual rent. But here's the twist: those prestige cloaks were shockingly fragile. Unpatched, unmodified, they were discarded when fashions changed, while a peasant's patchwork cloak evolved over decades, adapting to new owners and new needs. The true rebellion lay in the optics. At a glance, a noble's cloak screamed, "I can afford waste," but a peasant's cloak whispered, "I can make waste useful." In a world where sumptuary laws forbade the lower classes from wearing certain fabrics, patchwork became a loophole, a way to smuggle fragments of luxury into everyday life. That crimson scrap from a bishop's discarded robe, worn to church, it was a silent jab at clerical excess, the wolf pelt lining traded from a huntsman. A middle finger to laws reserving fur for nobles, so the next time you see a medieval tapestry, don't just admire the knights in their pristine mantles. Look for the figures in the margins. Their cloaks a kaleidoscope of struggle and stubborn pride. Because history isn't just woven by those who wear the finest wool. Sometimes it's stitched together by those who know how to make scraps into armor. In the glittering courts of medieval Europe, a nobleman's surcoat wasn't just clothing, it was a wearable family tree, stitched in silk and painted with pride. These sleeveless garments, draped over armor like a second skin, transformed knights into walking tapestries of lineage. Every swirl of crimson, every golden lion rampant, whispered a story of conquests and alliances. Take the famed surcoat of William Marshall. Its alternating bands of red and green, studded with the roaring lions of England's Plantagenets, didn't just identify him in battle, it declared him the king's favored protector, a man whose very fabric was interwoven with royal favor. But surcoats weren't just vanity projects, they were tactical branding. On smoke-choked battlefields where visors hid faces and mud obscured armor, these bold designs functioned like medieval QR codes. A knight could spot his liege lord's zigzag stripes through the chaos or recognize an ally's cross and crown motif before locking swords. Even off the battlefield, surcoats performed political theater. At court, a noble might commission a new design after marrying into a powerful family, literally draping himself in his in-laws' prestige. The more intricate the heraldry, the louder the message. My bloodline is a fortress. Peasants, barred from heraldry by law, invented their own silent language of belonging. A blacksmith's leather apron, scorched at the edges from forged sparks, became his unofficial crest. Fishermen stitched crude shell patterns into their tunics, while midwives might knot a red thread at their belt, a subtle signal to villagers in need. These weren't just practical markers, they were proofs of identity in a world where surnames were rare among the lower classes. A miller's flour-dusted sleeves told his story as clearly as any noble's embroidered griffin. The irony, while nobles paid artists to perfect their coats of arms, peasant symbols often outlasted them. Heraldic designs shifted with political winds. A disgraced family's surcoat might be burned, its symbols outlawed, but the baker's flowery apron. It never went out of style, because in the end, fashion isn't just about declaring who you are. It's about proving what you do, and no amount of silk could make a lazy lord's surcoat shine like the calloused hands of a bread maker at dawn. Imagine walking through a crowded medieval hall and hearing the delicate chime of tiny bells before you even saw the noblewoman approaching. This was the power of the belled girdle, a fashion statement that didn't just shimmer, it sang. These ornate waistbands, woven from threads of silver or gold and studded with bells no larger than thimbles, transformed every movement into a performance. With each step, the wearer announced her presence like human wind chimes, a living soundtrack to her own privilege. Unlike the muffled footfalls of servants scurrying in the background, the nobility turned their very gait into a melody, ensuring no one could ignore their entrance or their status. But these bells weren't just decorative noise. They functioned as medieval sonar, cutting through the chaos of feasts and court gatherings. In dimly lit halls thick with smoke and chatter, the sound of jingling marked a noblewoman's path, signaling others to part ways or bow as she passed. Some girdles even featured tiered bells, with deeper tones for slower, more regal strides, a sonic code that distinguished, say, a countess from a baroness. And heaven forbid a peasant girl dared to stitch a single bell onto her belt. Sumptuary laws in cities like Florence explicitly forbade it, reserving the right to jingle exclusively for the elite. Peasants, meanwhile, relied on belts so plain they were nearly invisible. A strip of boiled leather, perhaps dyed with walnut husks for a dull brown, cinched tunics at the waist without fanfare. These were tools, not treasures, sturdy enough to hold a knife sheath, a pouch for seed, or the weight of a child hoisted onto a hip. Where noble girdles jingled, peasant belts worked, their only adornment the occasional notch carved to mark a year of hard seasons survived. The irony, while nobles used bells to demand attention, peasants found clever ways to mute themselves. Hunters wrapped their belts in cloth to silence creaks that might scare game. Midwives wore rope sashes that wouldn't clatter during nighttime calls. Even the sound of fashion, it seems, obeyed the rules of class. Some were meant to be heard, others to disappear. Yet the belled girdle's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Today's high-end handbags with chiming charms or the deliberate click of designer heels trace their roots back to this medieval obsession with audible opulence. Because whether it's silk rustling or diamonds catching the light, fashion has always been about more than what meets the eye. Sometimes it's what meets the ear that cuts deepest. While nobles lounged under silk canopies or shaded themselves with perfumed gloves, peasants faced the sun's fury, armed with nothing but straw and ingenuity. The wide-brimmed straw hat woven from river reeds, barley stalks, or whatever tough grasses grew nearby wasn't just headgear, it was a survival tool. Picture a field worker at midday, their hat's brim casting a shadow broad enough to shield not just their face, but their shoulders too, turning their head into a portable patch of shade. These hats weren't bought, they were made, often by the same hands that wore them, their uneven weaves bearing the unique fingerprints of their creators. Some were stiffened with linseed oil to repel rain, others lined with scraps of cloth to cushion against the rough braids, each modification a quiet testament to problem-solving passed down through generations. What's striking is how these humble hats became archives of family history. A father might teach his child to weave by repairing the same hat year after year, its brim expanding with each growing season like rings in a tree. Faded patches where sweat had bleached the straw told stories of droughts endured, while a cluster of tighter stitches near the crown might mark the summer a hailstorm forced hasty repairs. Unlike noble headwear discarded when fashions shifted, straw hats were patched until they practically disintegrated, and even then, the remaining strands might be tossed into a compost heap or used to kindle a hearth. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. Nobles, of course, treated hats as disposable art. A feathered chaperon might be worn once to a hunt, then abandoned when the plumage wilted. Ladies' veils, delicate as spider silk, often tore after a single windy afternoon outing, but the true irony, while noble headwear demanded attendance, to adjust veils, secure pins, or rescue caps from gusts, a peasant's straw hat needed no such coddling. Tossed onto a hook, crushed under a sack, or even used as an impromptu basket for berries, it endured. That resilience made it more than just a tool. It became a quiet act of defiance. In a world where the elite's fashions were as fragile as their power was absolute, the straw hat stood unbroken season after season, yet even here class tensions simmered. In some regions, sumptuary laws banned peasants from wearing certain hat shapes reserved for nobility, no wide brims for you, lest you dare to mimic a lord's hunting bonnet. But straw, unlike silk, couldn't be legislated. It grew freely, it bent without breaking, and it answered to no king. So while nobles flaunted hats that declared their status, peasants wore hats that whispered something subtler. I am rooted here like the grain I harvest. And in the end, which message proved more enduring, the next time you see a medieval painting of a sun-scorched harvest, look past the golden fields to the bent figures within them. Their hats may be the color of dust, but their legacy, that's woven in gold. Dagged edges turned medieval nobility into walking paper dolls, their sleeves and hems slashed into intricate patterns of peaks and curves, each snip a deliberate act of calculated waste. This wasn't just decoration, it was fashion's equivalent of burning money in public. Known as dagging, the trend began innocently enough, a way to reveal the costly linings of garments, like flashing a silk interior when a cloak fluttered open. But soon, nobles were competing to see who could carve their hems into the most absurdly elaborate designs, scallops mimicking castle battlements, zigzags sharp enough to draw blood, even dangling strips that swayed like seaweed with every step. The more fabric sacrificed to these decorative cuts, the louder the statement. I can afford to turn cloth into confetti. Peasants, of course, had no such luxuries. Their sleeves ended in tight, utilitarian cuffs hemmed with painstaking double stitches to resist fraying from constant labor. Where noble dagging flaunted fragility, peasant seams celebrated durability, reinforced with patches before the first tear even appeared. The contrast was stark. Nobility played at destruction, slicing perfectly good wool into lace-like fantasies, while commoners treated every thread as a lifeline. Yet dagging's frivolity hid a darker irony. The trend coincided with periods of famine and war, when cloth was scarce and peasants often wore rags. Sumptuary laws in cities like Nuremberg attempted to curb the excess, limiting the length of dagged edges for lower classes. But nobles simply doubled down, commissioning garments with double layers of dagging, like a sleeve within a sleeve, each layer more extravagantly shredded than the last. Some even lined the cut edges with fur, so the strips would brush against their skin like a constant caress of luxury. What's fascinating is how dagging became a metaphor for the elite's detachment. While peasants darned socks until they disintegrated, nobles reveled in self-inflicted damage, treating their clothing as disposable theater. A single banquet might ruin a dagged gown, as grease stained the delicate edges or wine dyed the slashed hems beyond repair, but no matter. Tomorrow's outfit would be even more extravagantly mutilated. By the Renaissance, dagging had unraveled, its excesses out of step with new ideals of classical restraint. But its legacy lingers in modern fashion, from punk safety-pinned rebellion to designer distressed denim. The difference today, anyone can buy pre-torn jeans. In the Middle Ages, only the privileged could afford to play at poverty while never fearing its touch. The smock frock was the medieval peasant's second skin, a garment so unpretentious it became revolutionary. Woven from the scratchy wool of local sheep or rough linen beaten soft by countless washings, this knee-length tunic was the uniform of the fields, the workshop, and the hearth. Unlike the fitted silhouettes of noble dress, the smock frock hung loose from shoulder to hem, its roomy sleeves allowing a woodcutter to swing an axe or a milkmaid to bend without splitting seams. Every stitch served a purpose: reinforced gussets under the arms for freedom of movement, a high neckline to shield against chafing from carrying loads, and a belt cinched at the waist to transform excess fabric into impromptu pockets for tools or foraged herbs. This wasn't just clothing, it was a masterclass in functional design, refined over generations of calloused hands. Nobles, swaddled in layers of silk and fur, sneered at the smock frock's simplicity. To them, its unadorned fabric and boxy cut symbolized poverty, proof of a life devoid of refinement. Yet the joke was on them. While noble fashions cycled through absurd, body-contorting trends, from corsets that cracked ribs to sleeves so tight they cut off circulation, the peasant's smock frock remained virtually unchanged for centuries. Its genius lay in its adaptability. In winter, it could be layered over straw-stuffed undergarments for warmth. In summer, its breathable fabric wicked sweat away. Unlike the noble's delicate velvets, which disintegrated under sunlight or rain, the smock frock grew softer and more durable with wear, its fibers memorizing the shape of its owner's labor. What's fascinating is how this lowly garment quietly infiltrated high fashion. By the late Middle Ages, practical-minded merchants and artisans began adopting looser tunics inspired by the smock frock's design, much to the aristocracy's horror. Even physicians championed its health benefits, noting that peasants suffered fewer skin ailments than nobles' trust in restrictive garb. The smock frock's influence peaked during the Renaissance, when artists and scholars embracing humanist ideals rejected convoluted court dress in favor of simpler, more natural silhouettes. Suddenly, the garment once mocked as a symbol of backwardness became a subtle rebellion against excess, a precursor to modern comfort-first fashion. But perhaps the smock frock's greatest legacy was its democracy. While sumptuary laws dictated who could wear ermine or brocade, no one legislated against linen and wool. A shepherd's smock might be dyed with onion skins for a muted yellow, a brewer's stained with malt and hops, but the cut remained universal. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, here was a rare equalizer, a garment that fit king and commoner alike, if only they dared to wear it. And that's the delicious irony. While nobles' wardrobes filled with garments too delicate to touch real life, the peasant's humble tunic outlasted them all, its threads woven not just with flax but with resilience. Ermine trim wasn't just fur, it was a visual anthem of divine right, stitched into the very edges of medieval power. Picture a queen's coronation cloak, its snowy surface dotted with precise black specks, each tail tip placed like a punctuation mark in a sentence that read, "I am chosen." These pelts came from stoats, small weasels that turned pure white in winter, their black-tipped tails the only flaw in an otherwise immaculate coat. But here's the catch: capturing them alive without damaging that precious fur required teams of hunters and trappers, often working in frozen forests for weeks. A single cloak might need hundreds of pelts, their tiny bodies sewn together into a tapestry of exclusivity. The message was ruthless. This wasn't just warmth, it was a monument to the labor of others. What made ermine truly untouchable was its legal status. In kingdoms like France and England, sumptuary laws reserved ermine for royalty or high-ranking nobles, with penalties ranging from fines to imprisonment for unauthorized wear. The fur became so synonymous with sovereignty that it appeared in royal portraits like a visual signature. Henry Roman VIII robes bristled with it, as if daring viewers to question his right to rule. Even the church bowed to its symbolism. Bishops lined their vestments with ermine to signify spiritual purity, though the irony of wrapping piety in something so extravagantly cruel wasn't lost on critics. Peasants, meanwhile, made do with what they could trap or trade. Rabbit fur, often patchworked from a dozen pelts, lined winter hoods. Sheepskin, with its lanolin-rich fibers, repelled rain but carried none of ermine's prestige. Some resourceful families even used cat fur, a fact discreetly omitted from tapestries. But the true ingenuity lay in fake ermine. Inventive dyers stained rabbit pelts with charcoal to mimic the black tips, a dangerous game of fashion forgery that could land them in stocks if discovered. The darkest twist, ermine's purity, was a carefully constructed illusion. Those flawless white pelts required meticulous upkeep, stored with lavender to repel moths, brushed with chalk powder to maintain brightness. A single stain could ruin a pelt's value, so nobles avoided wearing ermine near anything resembling actual life. No feasting spills, no muddy streets, certainly no child's sticky fingers. It was fur meant for portraits, not people. Meanwhile, a peasant's sheepskin cloak, stinking of lanolin and patched with leather, could withstand a blizzard, a barnyard, or a toddler's grasp without losing its purpose. So why did ermine endure? Because it embodied the ultimate medieval paradox. The closer you were to power, the more your clothing rejected the messiness of living. While peasants wore their survival in every stain and mend, nobility draped themselves in a fantasy of spotless perfection, a fantasy that, like the stoat's winter coat, melted away when exposed to the heat of reality. Walk through any medieval village after a rainstorm, and the sound would give away who was who before you even saw them: nobles squelching through mud in ruined silk slippers, while peasants clattered by on wooden pattens, dry and defiantly above it all. These ingenious elevated sandals, strapped over regular shoes with leather thongs, were the ultimate hack for surviving streets that doubled as open sewers. Carved from a single block of alder or willow, pattens lifted wearers inches above the muck, their thick soles weathering everything from horse dung to butcher's runoff. But what's fascinating isn't just their practicality, it's how they became a quiet rebellion against the very idea of dirt. Nobles, of course, had other solutions for filth. They rode in enclosed litters, their feet never touching ground, or hired servants to spread costly rushes over particularly foul patches. When they did walk, their delicate shoes, poulanes with toes so long they needed chains, were sacrificial lambs to the mud, disposable symbols of wealth. But peasants, they engineered resilience. Pattens weren't just footwear, they were multi-tools. The curved undersides, often grooved like modern tire treads, provided traction on slick cobbles. Some designs featured iron rings or nails to prevent splitting, while others had hollowed platforms to reduce weight. In winter, straw could be stuffed inside for insulation, transforming them into makeshift snow boots. The real genius lay in their adaptability. A farmer's pattens might have wider blocks to distribute weight across soft field edges, while a brewer's were taller to navigate puddles of spilled ale. Women's versions sometimes had decorative cutouts not for vanity, but to reduce material without sacrificing lift, and when patterns wore down, they were whittled into kindling or carved into children's toys, a cycle of reuse that would make modern sustainability advocates weep with admiration. Yet patterns carried social baggage. In cities like London, sumptuary laws forbade lower classes from wearing certain shoe styles, but no one banned wooden soles. Why? Because no noble would dream of strapping on something so crude. That oversight let peasants turn necessity into a subtle jab at elite delicacy. While nobles limped home with ruined silk, the common folk clomped past, their patterns drumming out a rhythm that said, "We walk through your mess, but we don't drown in it." The ultimate irony, today's designer platform shoes owe more to patterns than any noble slipper, those chunky heels and thick soles strutting down runways. Just medieval peasant tech polished for the elite. Some revolutions aren't fought with swords, they're one dry footstep at a time. Sideless surcoats turned noble women into walking illusions, garments so cunningly cut they seem to defy physics. These gowns, with their dramatic side panels sliced away from armpit to hip, revealed flashes of jewel-toned underdresses beneath, creating the effect of a floating bodice tethered only by slender straps. At first glance, they appeared impossibly delicate, as if the wearer might step out of them with a single deep breath, but the deception was deliberate. By framing the body like a portrait, narrow waist emphasized, hips artfully widened, the sideless surcoat sculpted its wearer into the medieval ideal of fertility and grace. This wasn't just fashion, it was optical engineering designed to make nobility seem untouchable even as they moved through crowded halls. What made the style truly exclusive was its built-in impracticality. Without side panels, surcoats offered no protection from drafts, requiring layers of heated undergarments and fur-lined kirtles beneath. Servants had to adjust the gown constantly to prevent gaping, while the wearer herself moved with measured, swan-like glides to avoid revealing too much. Contrast this with a peasant woman's dress, snug from neckline to ankle, its tight sleeves allowing her to knead bread, spin wool, or hoist a child onto her back without a second thought. Where noble fashion restricted, peasant clothing liberated, each stitch answering to the demands of labor rather than the whims of aesthetics. Yet the sideless surcoat's genius lay in its symbolism. Those gaping side openings weren't just displays of luxury fabric beneath, they were literal windows into privilege. While peasant women's dresses were often pieced together from scraps, the underdresses revealed by surcoats were whole bolts of silk or samite, dyed in colors like imperial purple that commoners were forbidden to wear. Even the act of standing still became a performance. The more ornate the underdress, the more wealth could be flaunted without overt movement. Some noblewomen took it further, sewing tiny bells along the edges of the cutouts so every step rang with audible extravagance. The irony, this fragile style outlasted many sturdier trends. Surviving examples show reinforced stitching at stress points, proving these gowns were built to endure years of courtly pageantry. Meanwhile, peasant dresses, though tougher in fabric, often wore through at elbows and knees from constant use, their durability no match for the unrelenting grind of labor. That paradox captures medieval fashion's cruelest truth. What looked delicate was often armored by privilege, while what appeared sturdy bore the scars of survival. So the next time you see a medieval portrait of a woman with a waist you could circle with your hands, look closer. Those missing panels weren't just about beauty. They were blank spaces where nobility wrote their favorite lie, "I am above the mundane." Meanwhile, the peasant's snug sleeves told a different story, one of arms that shaped the world, even as the world refused to see them. A blacksmith's leather apron wasn't just protection, it was a battlefield trophy. Each scorch mark and oil stain a badge of hard-won mastery. Thick as a shield and stiffened by years of forge heat, these aprons could deflect flying sparks like armor, their surfaces charred into a topography of near misses and close calls. But what's fascinating isn't just their durability, it's how they became living records of their wearers' lives. A master smith might carve notches along the hem for every apprentice trained, or stitch extra loops near the waist to hold specialized tongs. Some aprons developed a permanent curve from the way the wearer leaned against an anvil, the leather molding to their body like a second skeleton. This wasn't just workwear, it was a portrait in hide and grit. Nobles, meanwhile, played at labor with costumes that mocked the very idea of toil. Their craftsman robes worn for symbolic guild ceremonies were woven from velvet dyed the color of soot, with golden thread embroidering fake hammer marks along the sleeves. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where a blacksmith's apron absorbed the brutal poetry of fire and iron, noble robes repelled even dust, their pristine surfaces declaring, "We admire your work from a safe distance." But the true rebellion of the leather apron lay in its defiance of hierarchy. While sumptuary laws dictated who could wear ermine or silk, no one regulated the tools of trade. A blacksmith's daughter might inherit her father's apron, its stains and repairs telling stories no chronicle could capture. Some aprons even became local legends, like the one said to have saved its wearer when a horseshoe exploded mid-strike, the leather taking the brunt of the shrapnel. The ultimate irony, today's artisan chic fashion borrows heavily from these aprons, with designers selling distressed leather versions for hundreds of dollars. But no amount of artificial weathering can replicate the real thing. That moment when a blacksmith's apron becomes so infused with smoke and sweat, it can stand upright on its own, a monument not to wealth but to work that shapes the world. Chaperones began life as the medieval equivalent of a workman's hood, a simple cape with a tail to shield peasant necks from rain or sun, its rough wool smelling of lanolin and sweat. But by the 15th century, this humble headgear had undergone a bizarre transformation, twisted and tucked into the ultimate noble status symbol. Picture a duke at court, his chaperone's long, liripipe tail no longer dangling down his back, but artfully coiled around his head like a fabric crown, the excess fabric arranged in precise folds that took servants hours to perfect. What was once a farmer's practical cover against the elements had become a high-maintenance art project, its very impracticality now the point. The chaperone's journey from field to throne room reveals fashion's trickle-up irony. Nobles didn't just adopt the style, they reverse-engineered it into absurdity. The original hood's short peak, designed to keep rain off a ploughman's face, stretched into a floppy protrusion called a cornet, sometimes stiffened with wire to jut dramatically over the wearer's forehead like the prow of a ship. The liripipe, once a functional drawstring to tighten the hood, now dangled to the knee or even the floor, its length directly proportional to the wearer's rank. Some nobles weighted the ends with lead beads to make them swing ostentatiously with every step, turning a peasant's utilitarian knot into a kinetic display of waste. What's fascinating is how this co-opting of working-class gear exposed the elite's selective borrowing. While sumptuary laws barred peasants from wearing silk or ermine, no one stopped nobles from pillaging peasant designs, so long as they rendered them unrecognizable through excess. A laborer's hood, stiff with dirt and patched at the elbows, was vulgar, but that same hood remade in Flemish wool, lined with Miniver fur, and dyed crimson with expensive kerms. Suddenly, it was haute couture. The message was clear: poverty was only fashionable when it came with a gold-stitched disclaimer. Yet the chaperone story isn't just one of theft, it's about resistance. In Flanders, where the style first gained noble traction, weavers and merchants began wearing their own, luxury versions as a quiet revolt. Their chaperones used cheaper fabrics but mimicked the elaborate wraps, blurring the lines between classes until furious nobles passed laws specifying exact dimensions for liripipes. Too long, you're impersonating aristocracy. Too short, you're insulting them. The hood had become a measuring tape for power. By the Renaissance, the chaperone unraveled as hats regained popularity, but its legacy lingers in every modern trend that elevates workwear. Think designer overalls or artisanal carpenter jeans. Because fashion's oldest game isn't inventing something new. It's taking what belongs to the powerless and calling it innovation once it's safely out of their reach. Beneath the shimmering silks and ermine-trimmed robes of medieval nobility, a secret itch gnawed at their consciences literally. Hair shirts, woven from coarse goat hair or even prickly horsehair, became the ultimate paradox of privilege, discomfort as a status symbol. These garments, worn against the skin under layers of opulent clothing, served as self-inflicted punishment for sins real or imagined. Picture a countess at a feast, her neckline dripping with pearls, while beneath her gown, the rough fibers scraped like 1,000 tiny knives with every movement. This wasn't just piety, it was performance art where suffering became as curated as a tapestry. What's striking is how hair shirts turned pain into a luxury. Only the wealthy could afford such theatrical remorse. The finest hair shirts were tailored to precise specifications, some with sleeves to maximize skin contact, others with strategic knots to intensify the scratching. Monastic suppliers even offered graded versions, milder shirts for minor transgressions, brutal ones for mortal sins. Meanwhile, peasants endured actual hardship without the need for symbolic gestures. A farmer's wool tunic, stiff with sweat and lanolin, chafed enough without adding horsehair to the mix. For them, suffering wasn't a choice, it was the fabric of daily life. The irony, hair shirts often backfired. Chronicles recount nobles discreetly lining them with silk to dull the itch or, forgetting, to wear them during particularly festive occasions. One bishop was caught bribing his tailor to sew a hair shirt's exterior visible at the collar, while the interior remained soothingly smooth. Even in penance, the elite found loopholes. Yet the trend reveals a deeper truth about medieval morality. While peasants' calloused hands and sunburnt necks testified to their labor, nobles needed tangible proof of their virtue. A hair shirt's itch was a receipt, a way to quantify piety in an era when salvation could feel like a transaction. Today, we might see echoes of this in no pain, no gain, fitness culture, or luxury wellness retreats that simulate deprivation. Because sometimes the ultimate privilege isn't avoiding discomfort, it's choosing it. A wimple wasn't just fabric, it was a medieval Rorschach test, revealing starkly different truths depending on who wore it. Picture a noblewoman at mass, her face encircled by a pristine linen wimple so starched it barely moved when she bowed her head, the folds arranged to emphasize the pallor of her skin, a mark of privilege that meant she'd never labored under the sun. Now shift to a peasant woman in the fields, her wimple damp with sweat and tied hastily under her chin, its primary purpose not piety but shielding her neck from blistering heat. Same garment, two entirely unspoken languages. For nobility, the wimple was a masterclass in coded messaging. The tighter the wrap around the throat, the more modest the wearer appeared, though the effect was often undermined by the sheer expense of the materials. Fine Flemish linen, bleached to a luminous white, needed constant upkeep. Servants spent hours washing, pressing, and folding these strips of cloth into geometric perfection. Some noblewomen even tucked scraps of scented parchment into the folds, ensuring their wimples released a whisper of rose or ambergris with every turn of the head. The irony, a garment meant to symbolize humility became a billboard for conspicuous consumption. Peasants, meanwhile, turned wimples into multi-purpose survival gear. Rough hemp or undyed wool replaced linen with wider cuts to cover shoulders during harvest. Dairymaids soaked theirs in cold water to stay cool, while goose girls used the tails to wipe dirt from their hands. Unlike the noble version, rigid as a portrait frame, peasant wimples twisted and knotted throughout the day, adjusted to cradle sleeping infants or bundle kindling. The real kicker, sumptuary laws often required lower-class women to cover their hair, framing the wimple as a tool of control, yet peasants subverted it by dyeing the edges with whatever pigments they could forage, staining the modesty uniform with muted greens or yellows. The wimple's ultimate contradiction lay in its legacy. While noble versions vanished with the Renaissance, peasant adaptations evolved into the headscarves still worn by farm workers across Europe today. A garment born of restriction became, in calloused hands, a testament to resourcefulness, proof that even the strictest symbols can be rewoven, thread by thread, into something wholly unexpected. Chainmail coifs turned battlefield necessity into a medieval red carpet statement, proof that even warriors needed a little bling. Originally designed to shield knights' heads and necks from slashing blades, these hoods of interlocking metal rings were brutally practical, their weight alone enough to make an untrained fighter stagger. But by the 13th century, nobles who'd never swung a sword in anger were draping themselves in gilded versions, the iron rings polished to a mirror shine or even dipped in silver to catch the candlelight at banquets. Imagine a count at court, his coif's edges stitched with tiny rubies to mimic blood spatter, a macabre inside joke among the safely pampered. What made this trend so audacious was its blatant cosplay of violence. While actual knights scrubbed rust from their mail after battles, noble coifs were deliberately aged with vinegar to create authentic patinas, as if the wearer had just returned from crusade. Some versions used lighter alloys or spaced the rings wider to reduce weight, sacrificing all defensive utility for the sake of silhouette. The message was clear: I could be dangerous if I ever had to be. Meanwhile, peasants encountered chainmail only in its functional form, stripped from dead soldiers after battles or glimpsed on the rare night passing through their village. To them, those interlocking rings meant something far darker than fashion. They were the sound of an approaching army, the metallic whisper of a lord's justice. Yet the coif's transformation reveals a deeper truth about medieval status symbols. martial gear became elite fashion precisely because it was unattainable. Sumptuary laws often forbade commoners from owning weapons or armor, making chainmail the ultimate exclusive accessory. A noble's decorative coif wasn't just stylish, it was a velvet-gloved reminder that violence, like luxury, was a privilege reserved for the few. Some particularly cynical lords even wore them to tax collections, a not-so-subtle hint about the consequences of refusal. The irony, those showpiece coifs would have been death traps in real combat. Their delicate alloys bent under blunt force, their decorative clasps snapped at the first arrow strike. But nobility didn't care. Like modern designer, tactical gear worn by civilians, the point wasn't function. It was the fantasy of power, polished to perfection, and divorced from the blood it was meant to stop. So the next time you see a medieval portrait of a nobleman smirking in his gilded mail, remember, that coif wasn't armor. It was costume jewelry for a class that turned even war into a spectator sport. Gloves in the Middle Ages told a story of hands, some cracked and calloused from labor, others soft and idle, their fingers barely brushing against real work. For peasants, gloves were tools first, art second. Fingerless designs dominated the fields and workshops, allowing wool-wrapped palms to grip plow handles or weaving shuttles while keeping frostbite at bay. These were no delicate accessories. They were armor against the elements, stitched from coarse sheepskin with the hair left inside for warmth. Some even had leather patches sewn across the palms, reinforcing the spots where tools wore through fastest, a tactile record of their wearer's daily grind. The genius lay in their adaptability. In summer, the fingerless design allowed for threading needles or kneading dough, while winter called for removable wool mittens tied over the top. Every stitch served a purpose, every stain told a season's story. Nobles, of course, turned gloves into theater. Imagine a duke receiving a pair of gloves embroidered with silver, thread so fine it shimmered like frost, only to place them in a glass cabinet, untouched. These weren't meant for hands, they were meant for eyes. Gifting gloves became a political language unto itself. A queen might present a pair lined with ermine to a favored ambassador, the fur's purity signaling trust. Troubadours sang of lovers exchanging gloves perfumed with ambergris, their scent lingering long after the wearer had left. The most extravagant pairs were never even sewn for human hands. Some were crafted as offerings to saints, their tiny fingers stuffed with relics and displayed like trophies. The irony, while peasants' gloves grew softer with use, their fibers matted by sweat and soil, noble gloves often stiffened with disuse. Leather cracked from lack of wear, embroidered threads frayed in display cases. Sumptuary laws added another layer of absurdity. In Venice, only patricians could wear gloves dyed with rare scarlet, while in England, certain stitches were reserved for royalty. A merchant's wife risked fines for owning gloves too richly worked, even as noblewomen draped them over falcons' heads as whimsical hoods. Yet the most subversive twist came from those who straddled both worlds. Wealthy merchants commissioned hybrid gloves, outwardly plain kid leather, but lined with silk so lush it tickled the palm. Surgeons wore fingerless designs with hidden pockets for scalpels, blending utility with secrecy. Even the church got in on the act, with bishops wearing gloves during Mass to signify their hands were undefiled by worldly toil, a slap to every farmer whose blisters fed them. So the next time you pull on winter gloves, remember their medieval ancestors. Whether wrapped around a plow or displayed like jewels, gloves were never just about warmth. They were maps of power, stitched in thread and leather, proof that even our hands can't escape the weight of who we are. Parti-colored hose turned noble legs into walking balance sheets, a flamboyant accounting of wealth stitched in scarlet and sapphire. Imagine a duke striding through court with one leg blazing in vermilion, the other midnight blue, the stark divide between his thighs screaming, "I can afford to waste 2 precious dyes on a single garment." This wasn't just fashion, it was arithmetic in silk, each mismatched hoe's leg representing enough imported pigment to feed a peasant family for months. The bolder the contrast, the louder the statement. I have so much I can deliberately create imbalance. Peasants, meanwhile, wore hose that told a different story, dull, undyed wool, often pieced together from mismatched remnants when the original fabric wore through. Their leggings weren't statements but survival gear, patched at the knees until the seams resembled topographic maps of hardship. Where nobles flaunted their ability to waste, peasants celebrated their ability to mend, turning every darned hole into a quiet victory over scarcity. The irony, those patched peasant hose often lasted longer than their gaudy noble counterparts, reinforced by necessity where luxury frayed from neglect. The true genius of parti-coloring lay in its exclusivity. Creating such vivid contrasts required dyes like Tyrian purple or kermes, red substances so costly they were measured in silver per ounce. Sumptuary laws in cities like Florence explicitly forbade merchants from wearing divided hose, reserving the right to clownish asymmetry for the elite. Some nobles took the trend further, slashing their hose to reveal flashes of fur-lined underlayers or embroidering each leg with rival family crests, turning their limbs into heraldic battlegrounds. Yet even this trend couldn't escape rebellion. Wealthy merchants, barred by law from party colors, found loopholes, dyeing hose in similar but not identical shades like crimson and russet, close enough to hint at extravagance but distant enough to dodge fines. Apprentices in some trades stitched secret mismatched linings, reveling in the private joke of hidden opulence. The message was clear: where nobility flaunted excess openly, the rising middle class wore their defiance under wraps. By the Renaissance, party colors faded as new trends emerged, but their legacy lingers in modern fashion's love of asymmetry, from mismatched sleeves to deliberately clashing prints. The difference today: anyone can buy discordant designs. In the Middle Ages, only those with power could afford to be boldly, blatantly unbalanced. And that's the twisted beauty of parti-colored hose. They didn't just display wealth. They weaponized it, one audaciously clashing leg at a time. Pilgrims' badges transformed piety into portable bragging rights, tiny tokens of devotion that doubled as medieval status symbols. Picture a peasant returning from Canterbury, his hat studded with cheap lead badges showing St. Thomas Becket's shrine, their edges already tarnishing in the rain. Each one marked miles walked, dangers survived, and sins theoretically absolved. But here's the twist: these humble souvenirs weren't just spiritual receipts. Sewn proudly onto cloaks or caps, they became wearable proof of a world beyond the village, a scrap of prestige even the poorest pilgrim could flaunt. Nobles, never ones to be outdone, turned pilgrimage badges into high art. Forget rough lead. Their versions glittered with enamel and gemstones, depicting shrines like Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre in miniature gold. Some were so elaborate they doubled as brooches or book clasps, displayed at court to spark envious questions. A duchess might accidentally let her sleeve slip, revealing a Santiago de Compostela badge encrusted with lapis lazuli because nothing said, "I'm holier than you," like a jeweled shell motif that cost more than a farmer's harvest. The irony: both versions served the same purpose, turning faith into fashion. Peasants stitched their badges where they'd catch the eye, dangling from hoods or clustered on shoulder bags, while nobles integrated them into existing finery. A merchant's wife might mix lead badges from local shrines with a single sapphire-edged Rome token, subtly signaling both piety and upward mobility. Even the church got in on the act, selling official badges to fund cathedrals while decrying counterfeits hawked by opportunistic forgers. But the real genius of these badges lay in their democratization of prestige. For once, a serf and a lord could share the same cultural language, just on wildly unequal terms. A noble's jeweled badge might buy indulgence, but a peasant's lead one bought something rarer, respect at the tavern, and that tension made them dangerous. By the 15th century, sumptuary laws in some regions restricted who could wear certain shrine badges, terrified that a farmer's Canterbury trinket might blur the lines between sacred devotion and social climbing. Yet the trend's legacy endures in every souvenir T-shirt or iCity keychain today, because whether it's medieval lead or modern polyester, we've always worn our journeys not just to remember, but to be remembered. The difference nowadays, nobody arrests you for faking a trip to Paris. Girdle books took practicality to heretical heights, literally. Imagine a noblewoman strolling through a monastery garden, her Bible dangling from her belt like a jeweled pendulum, its cover hammered with silver and its pages edged in gold. These wearable manuscripts weren't just books, they were mobile libraries designed to flaunt both literacy and wealth in an era when most couldn't read their own names. The richer the owner, the more absurd the display. Some Girdle books featured covers so heavy they dragged belts askew, while others had clasps studded with gems that scratched the pages they were meant to protect. This wasn't just about piety, it was about turning knowledge into a literal weight to carry. Peasants, meanwhile, stored wisdom differently. A farmer might own a single psalter, its pages worn translucent from generations of fingers tracing the same prayers. Folded into a pocket or tucked into a thatched roof for safekeeping, these books were tools, not trophies. If a Girdle book shouted, "I can read," a peasant's battered psalter whispered, "I need to." The contrast couldn't have been starker. Nobility wore books as accessories while commoners clung to them as lifelines. What's fascinating is how Girdle books exposed the era's hypocrisy. The same nobles who paraded scripture on their hips often couldn't decipher its content, hence many hired priests to read aloud while they nodded along. Yet the trend persisted because the appearance of devotion mattered more than the practice. A chronicle from Burgundy even recounts a duchess whose Girdle book was secretly hollow, stuffed with love notes instead of psalms, the ultimate irony. Today's e-readers and audiobooks make Girdle books look almost practical, but medieval nobility would have recoiled at the thought of carrying literature without the weight. Because in the end, it wasn't about the words inside. It was about the strain on your hips, proof that enlightenment came with a luxury tax. Codpieces started life as a knight's afterthought, a simple flap of chainmail or leather laced over armored trousers to protect, well, the family jewels during battle. Practical, absolutely, subtle, barely noticeable, but by the time nobility got their hands on the idea, functionality flew out the window like a discarded jousting lance. Imagine a duke at court, his codpiece swollen with padding until it resembled a small melon, the fabric embroidered with gold thread and studded with pearls in a display so audacious it practically demanded its own heraldic crest. This wasn't just armor anymore, it was a proclamation in silk and stuffing, a billboard for virility or wishful thinking. Peasants, meanwhile, either skipped codpieces entirely or wore plain, unadorned versions, simple flaps that buttoned discreetly over their hose, designed for modesty during labor, not for turning heads in the throne room. A farmer bending over his plow didn't need his trousers to announce his manhood to the barley, but nobles, they turned codpieces into a competitive sport. Some were shaped like seashells or even animal heads, their tips jingling with tiny bells. Henry Roman VIII famously wore one wide enough to store a small purse because nothing says majesty like a monarch who could smuggle a loaf of bread in his breeches. The irony, the trend's absurdity backfired spectacularly. As codpieces grew larger, critics mocked them as pride pouches or false witness, accusing wearers of compensating for inadequacies. Satirical woodcuts showed men toppling forward under the weight of their own embellishments, while moralists warned that such vanity would anger God. Yet the more outrage they sparked, the more nobles doubled down padding, embroidering, even scenting their codpieces with musk to ensure they couldn't be ignored. But here's the twist. What began as courtly farce ended up shaping fashion for centuries. Those exaggerated bulges laid the groundwork for modern tailoring's subtle structuring, the way a suit jacket today might hint at broad shoulders without requiring actual armor. And the peasant's plain flap, it evolved into the humble buttonfly, proof that sometimes the quietest solutions outlast the loudest statements. Because whether it's the 16th century or the 21st, one rule remains: true confidence doesn't need padding. It just needs to show up, no bells attached. Felted wool was the medieval equivalent of a superfabric, a peasant innovation so brilliant it outsmarted nature itself. Picture a shepherd in the Alps, knee-deep in snow, his cloak repelling sleet like duck feathers, while noblemen shivered in their imported Flemish broadcloth. This wasn't just luck, it was chemistry in action. By agitating raw wool in hot water and lye, peasants transformed fluffy fibers into an impenetrable mat, shrinking it by a third to create a fabric so dense it could turn blades and stop winds cold. The process was laborious hours of rolling, pounding, and kneading the fibers until they locked together, but the result was a miracle. Lightweight yet windproof, breathable yet waterproof, and tough enough to outlast a decade of blizzards. Nobles, with their obsession for finery, missed the genius of felted wool entirely. They prized thin, imported woolens woven so loosely you could see sunlight through them, beautiful for tapestries, useless in a storm. When they did attempt felting, it was for frivolities like decorative hats or heraldic banners, never for survival. The irony, many noble estates raised the sheep that produced this wool, yet it took peasant hands to unlock its full potential. A lord's cloak might be lined with squirrel fur, but it was the shepherd's felted mantle that kept him alive during winter raids. The true revolution lay in felting's adaptability. Peasants tailored the process to their needs: thicker felts for mountain dwellers, lighter versions for valley farmers. Some mixed goat hair for extra stiffness, while others layered wool with beeswax for near-total waterproofing. Felted boots stuffed with dried grass for insulation became the medieval equivalent of all-weather gear. Even armor borrowed the technique. Mongol warriors wore felted undershirts beneath their lamellar plates, a trick learned from nomadic herdsmen. Yet felting's greatest legacy was its defiance of hierarchy. Unlike dyed silks or gem-studded brocades, felt required no royal permits or exotic imports. Any shepherd with a kettle and strong arms could produce it. That autonomy terrified the elite. In some regions, guilds banned peasants from selling felted goods in cities, fearing competition with luxury clothiers. But the bans failed because you can't outlaw ingenuity. While nobility's delicate fabrics molded in damp castles, peasant felts endured, their fibers growing denser and more resilient with every storm weathered. So the next time you zip up a modern waterproof jacket, thank medieval peasants. That Gore-Tex membrane, just high-tech felting. Because real innovation doesn't come from gold threads or royal decrees. It's born in the hands of those who have no choice but to outthink the cold. From the towering Henins that scraped castle ceilings to the straw hats that bent under the weight of the harvest sun, medieval fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was a war waged in fabric, dye, and silhouette. Every stitch carried meaning, every hem whispered allegiances. The nobility transformed clothing into a fortress of exclusivity, where the absurdity of a sleeve's length or the weight of a cloak's embroidery screamed louder than any herald's trumpet. This is not for you. Yet in the shadows of their excess, peasants stitched resilience into every patch, every felted woolen cloak, every pair of pattens that lifted them just inches above the filth nobles never had to tread. What's fascinating isn't just the divide, but the moments when fashion blurred the lines. Take the chaperon born on the sweat-soaked brows of laborers, only to be co-opted and twisted into a noble status symbol. Or the woad-dyed tunics of peasants, so steadfast in their simplicity that even merchants began sneaking hints of blue into their wardrobes. These weren't just trends, they were quiet revolutions, proof that style could be both a barrier and a bridge. The true legacy of medieval fashion lies in its contradictions. A noble's ermine-trimmed robe, pristine and untouchable, might crumble under a single storm, while a peasant's patchwork cloak, ugly and uneven, could outlast a decade of winters. The codpiece, inflated to absurdity by kings, became a punchline long before it faded, while the humble smock frock evolved into the workwear of artisans and scholars alike. Even the most oppressive sumptuary laws couldn't stop ingenuity. Peasants dyed, stitched, and repurposed their way around every restriction, turning scarcity into creativity. So, which of these trends resonated most with you? Was it the practicality of pattens clattering defiantly over cobblestones, or the audacity of poulanes, those devil-may-care shoes that tripped up even the wearers? Maybe it was the wimple framing faces high and low with equal grace, yet telling two entirely different stories. Drop your thoughts below. We're all just threads in history's tapestry after all. And if you enjoyed unraveling these sartorial secrets with us, don't forget to subscribe. The past is always in fashion. You just have to know where to